was one of those cold March nights when the chill seemed to cut through you. I had just finished an exhausting shift at the hospital, where I worked as a cleaning woman. The hours were brutal, but it was good, honest work. My drive home usually helped me unwind after a long shift. The quiet, the emptiness, it was all strangely peaceful, or so I thought. I hadn't realized how low my gas tank was that night until the little warning light blinked on. At that hour, there weren't many options, but I figured I'd find a station eventually. I pulled into the first gas station I saw. The place looked rundown, the kind you usually pass by without thinking twice. But it was open, and that was good enough for me. The lights flickered above, barely enough to do the job. The pumps looked ancient, worn down by years of neglect, and the only car in sight was a rusted pickup truck parked on the side. I parked near the closest pump and stepped out to fill my tank, shivering as the cold crept through my jacket. As I grabbed the nozzle, I noticed a man walking out from behind the station's small maintenance building. He was wearing a clean, well-pressed uniform. Something about the pristine look of him didn't quite fit with the rundown station, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured he must be part of the staff, though I hadn't seen anyone inside when I pulled in. He smiled as he approached, and it wasn't a friendly kind of smile. It was too wide, too forced, like he was trying too hard to convince me of something. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice smooth, but with a slight edge like it was trying to coax me into something. "No, I'm good, thanks," I replied, trying to act casual like it was no big deal. But something about him unsettled me. He wasn't dirty or disheveled like you'd expect at this kind of place. His uniform was spotless, his hands too clean. It didn't match the setting at all. He stayed put, just standing there as I tried to pump my gas. When the nozzle clicked, signaling it was full, I reached to replace it. That's when he stepped closer. "I can check your oil for you," he offered, stepping forward with too much eagerness. "No charge, I'll just pop the hood for a quick look." I shook my head, already feeling uneasy. "That's okay," I said, trying to avoid eye contact. "I'm fine," but he didn't move. "Are you sure? Looks like your car's running a little rough." "I'd hate for you to break down on a night like this," he said, his tone still too smooth. His persistence was starting to gnaw at me. I forced a tight smile, muttering something about needing to get home. I finished pumping the gas and reached for the cap, but then he was suddenly closer, just a foot or two away. His eyes flicked to the trunk. "I'll check the engine real quick," he said, already moving toward the latch. That's when my gut went from uncomfortable to full-on panic mode. My brain screamed something's wrong. "Get out of here now." I stepped back, my voice tight. "No, seriously, I need to go." He stopped, his hand hovering over the latch for a moment. We just stared at each other. Then his smile came again. But this time it wasn't the fake, forced grin. It was something different, something darker. He slipped one hand into his pocket, and my breath caught. Without thinking, I yanked open the door and jumped into my car. He didn't shout, didn't try to stop me. He just started walking toward the driver's side, his hand still in his pocket. My heart raced, and I wasn't dumb enough to wait and find out why. I slammed the car into reverse, my tires screeching as I backed up, narrowly missing a barrel of water. I didn't even bother to put my seatbelt on until I was halfway down the street. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights trailing behind me. Nothing. It felt like an eternity, even though I knew it had only been 20 minutes. The whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I stayed in the car for a moment, trying to calm my nerves. The house looked too dark, too quiet, but I forced myself to go inside. I locked every door, even the ones I usually ignored, then went straight to my bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing, trying to talk myself down. "Chill out, you're overthinking this," I muttered to myself. He's probably harmless. But that image, his smile, his hand in his pocket, the way he stood there unmoving, kept replaying in my mind. The next day at work, I told one of my coworkers what happened. "You've got to trust your instincts," she said. If it felt wrong, it probably was. 2 days later, I was scrolling through my phone during a break when a news alert popped up. My stomach dropped as I read the headline, "Man posing as gas station attendant wanted in connection with abduction." The article described a man matching his description, down to the spotless uniform and fake friendliness. The police were urging anyone with information to come forward. He had approached a woman at another station just a few miles from where I'd been. She hadn't been as lucky. They found her car abandoned in the desert the next morning, but she was still missing. The news hit me like a ton of bricks. My hands trembled as I read, and I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. I had nearly become his next target. That same day, after finishing my shift, I went straight to the police station. I sat down with an officer, still shaken but determined to do the right thing. I told them everything: his spotless uniform, his too wide smile, how he tried to get me to pop the hood and open the trunk. I described his height, build, and the exact location of the gas station. The officer took notes and assured me they'd look into it. Relief washed over me, but it was small. I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head. What if I hadn't listened to my gut? What if I had let him check my car? The what-ifs were endless and terrifying. I didn't sleep much that night. When I did, I dreamt of his smile, his hand in his pocket, the way he stared at me as I drove away. Since then, I've made a rule for myself: no more stopping at shady gas stations, no matter how low my tank is. I even started carrying a small canister of gas in my trunk, just in case. It's a small precaution, but it makes me feel a little safer. I can't drive past a gas station at night without a twinge of anxiety. But it also reminds me of the importance of trusting my instincts. They might just save your life. I took the night shift at a gas station just outside of town because I was strapped for cash and needed a second job. The station was located off Route 39, a lonely stretch of road surrounded by dense woods. It wasn't much to look at: a small, run-down building with flickering neon lights and a single pump that seemed like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. Most nights were uneventful, with only the occasional trucker or late-night traveler stopping by. But this particular night, this one still haunts me. It was around my second or third month on the job when this guy started coming in regularly, always really late at night, around 2 a.m. He was about 6 feet tall, with long, stringy hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. He'd always walk in, buy a tall boy beer, and leave. That was his routine. At first, I didn't pay him much attention. People like him weren't uncommon out here. But one night, he broke the routine. After grabbing his beer, he walked up to the counter, looked me straight in the eye, and asked, "What's your name?" "Rob," I answered, trying to keep my tone neutral. He grinned, a slow, unsettling smile. "Rob, I like that," he said, chuckling to himself. Then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, he cracked open the beer right there, took a long swig, and walked out, still laughing and muttering to himself. That night, I became curious. Was he drunk driving? I watched as he left the property, but instead of getting into a car, he walked off into the woods that lined the station. That explained why he never bought gas. He didn't have a car. He kept coming back, almost every night. Some nights he'd be noticeably drunker than others. Sometimes he'd just lean on one of the shelves, staring at nothing. He'd always greet me with the same line, "Hey Rob," like we were old friends. One night, after he had been standing silently for what felt like an eternity, I finally asked, "What's your name?" He hesitated, his bloodshot eyes narrowing slightly. Then he said, "Bob." "Bob, huh?" I replied. It felt fake, like the first name that popped into his head. Maybe because it rhymed with mine. "Yeah, Bob," he said, nodding to himself. "So Bob, where do you work?" I asked, trying to make conversation. His laugh was loud and jarring, echoing through the empty store. "Work? I don't work. The government screwed me over," he said, his tone suddenly bitter. Then, just as quickly, his expression softened, and he looked at me with an odd mix of anger and admiration. "But I like you, Rob. You seem like you know what you're doing." I didn't know what to say to that. He finished his beer, tossed the can on the counter, and walked out. I didn't see him again for over a week, which for a regular like him felt strange. Part of me was relieved, but another part couldn't shake the uneasy feeling he'd left behind. Then, on a stormy night, with rain pouring down in sheets and the wind howling through the trees, I heard the familiar ding of the front door. Before I even looked up, I knew it was him. But when I did, I froze. It was Bob, but he looked worse than ever. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his thin frame. His long hair hung in wet, matted clumps, and his face was pale, almost ghostly. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, dripping rainwater onto the floor, staring blankly at the wall. "Bob, are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaky. He didn't respond at first. Then, without looking at me, he said, "I did something really bad." My stomach dropped. "What did you do?" I asked cautiously. He turned his head slightly, his bloodshot eyes locking onto mine. "I need somewhere to hide," he muttered. Then he walked past me, heading toward the restroom hallway. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. What had he done? Should I call the police? Before I could decide, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the store into darkness. The storm must have knocked out the power. Grabbing the flashlight from under the counter, I made my way toward the back of the store. The hallway to the restrooms was eerily quiet. Both restroom doors were ajar, but when I shone my flashlight inside, they were empty. "Bob," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. That's when I heard it, the sound of dripping water, followed by the faint squeak of wet shoes. My flashlight beam darted to the corner of the storage room, and there he was. Bob crouched low, his eyes wide and wild. He lunged at me, screaming, "I'm gonna kill you." I stumbled back, his claw-like hands grazing my arm as I shoved him off. Adrenaline kicked in, and I bolted for the front of the store. Grabbing my jacket, I ran out into the storm and jumped into my car. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. The police arrived within minutes. They found Bob huddled in the storage room, muttering to himself. His pupils were dilated, and he was high on something. They arrested him on the spot. A month later, I found out the truth. Bob's real name was Martin, and he was wanted for brutally beating his ex-wife to death. The murder had happened the same night he showed up at the gas station, soaked and deranged. I quit the night shift after that. To this day, I can't drive past that gas station without feeling a chill run down my spine. The memory of Bob, or Martin, and the look in his eyes is something I'll never forget. Spring break in April 2023 found me driving through Tuscaloosa, Alabama on a solo road trip. As a 28-year-old college student, I was desperate for a break from the stress of exams and term papers. This trip was meant to be a mental reset. No strict itinerary, just the open road, my favorite playlists, and the freedom to stop wherever caught my eye. After hours of driving, my legs were stiff, and nature was urgently calling. I scanned the roadside and spotted a small, worn-down gas station just off the highway. The place looked ancient, with a faded sign that had lost most of its letters and gas pumps that seemed more decorative than functional. A single car, an old battered Honda, sat parked near the side of the building. Everything about the station screamed forgotten, and the eerie stillness in the air made the hair on my arms stand up. I pulled into a spot near the entrance, stepping out into the sweltering afternoon heat. The air was thick and unmoving, making the silence even more oppressive. As I walked toward the entrance, I noticed the building's exterior was streaked with grime, the windows fogged over from neglect. The bell above the door gave a weak jingle as I stepped inside. The interior was even worse than I'd imagined. Dust clung to every surface, and the shelves were half empty, stocked with faded snacks and cans of soda that looked like they'd been there for years. A faint smell of old coffee mixed with a hint of mildew lingered in the air. Behind the counter sat an elderly man, hunched over a newspaper. His thick glasses perched low on his nose as he ignored my presence entirely. "Excuse me," I said, breaking the silence. "Where's the restroom?" He grunted and gestured vaguely toward a dim hallway at the back of the store without lifting his eyes from the paper. His lack of interest was unsettling, but I shrugged it off and headed toward the restroom. The door to the bathroom was a faded blue, its surface covered in scratches and graffiti. Pushing it open, I stepped inside to find a cramped, dingy space. The tiles on the floor were cracked, and the walls were stained with years of grime. A rusted sink sat beneath a mirror so fogged with dirt that my reflection was barely visible. The fluorescent light flickered weakly, casting an intermittent glow. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. After taking care of business, I moved to the sink and washed my hands. The water trickled out in a thin, lukewarm stream, and the paper towel dispenser groaned as it reluctantly gave up a few damp sheets. I wiped my hands and reached for the door handle, ready to leave. But the door wouldn't budge. I frowned, jiggling the handle. It didn't move. I tried again, twisting and pulling harder, but it was no use. The door was stuck or locked. "Hello," I called out, knocking on the door. "The door's stuck. Can someone help me?" Silence. I banged louder, shouting, "Hey! I'm stuck in here. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, they approached from the other side of the door. Relief washed over me. Hey, I'm locked in. Can you open the door? But whoever it was didn't respond. They stopped just outside, their presence palpable through the thin door. Hello, I tried again, my voice faltering. The footsteps resumed, this time moving away, fading into the distance until the silence was complete. My relief turned to dread. Why hadn't they said anything? Why hadn't they helped? I banged on the door again, shouting louder. Minutes stretched on like hours, and I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear anything. But there was nothing, just the sound of my breathing. Suddenly, the door creaked open. I stumbled back as the elderly attendant stood in the doorway, looking annoyed. "What's all the noise about?" he grumbled. The door was locked. I snapped, my voice shaking with a mix of frustration and fear. I couldn't get out. He gave me a skeptical look, pushing his glasses higher on his nose. Locked, it doesn't lock from the outside. Must have been stuck. I'm telling you, it wouldn't open. I've been banging on it for. Well, it's open now, he interrupted with a shrug, clearly uninterested in my explanation. You're good to go. Something about his indifference made my skin crawl. I muttered a tense thanks and brushed past him, heading straight for the exit. My heart was still racing as I walked to my car, desperate to leave. But then I saw it. Standing in the shadows near the side of the building was a figure. It was too dark to make out any details, but someone or something was there, watching me. My pulse quickened, and I hurried to my car, fumbling with the keys before sliding inside and locking the doors. I started the engine, my eyes darting back to the shadows. The figure hadn't moved. I didn't wait to see what it would do. Pulling out of the lot, I sped back onto the highway, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Even as I put miles between myself and that gas station, the unease lingered. My mind replayed the sound of those footsteps, the suffocating silence, and the figure in the shadows. When I finally reached my hotel that night, I double-checked the locks on the door and wedged a chair under the handle for extra security. Sleep didn't come easily. The memory of that bathroom door and the figure outside replayed in my mind like a broken record. Weeks later, I still can't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me that day. I've searched for news about that gas station, hoping to find some explanation, but there's been nothing. No crimes and no reports of strange occurrences. Just silence. And maybe that's the scariest part. Whatever happened in that gas station bathroom will remain a mystery, a haunting reminder of how quickly the mundane can turn sinister.